All right, I have my jacket back fashion fabric prepped. I stitched my center back seam. Remember we had cut our center back seam with 1.5 inch seam allowance? Well, I realized that I don't need all of that seam allowance anymore. And with the shaped back, it didn't want to lay as flat as I wanted it to. So after I stitched my center back seam at 1.5 inches, I did trim it down so that it is 1 inch wide. And I feel good about leaving that inch in there. So I'm going to take my stay, which I have sewn together on the seam line. So you see there's a raw edge, there's a raw edge. It's a lapped seam, and I'm going to line this up onto my fashion fabric. I do have, I've got some notches here, so I want to make sure that I'm lining my markings up to make sure that where I need to be. This is my center back seam, so that stitch line lines up with the seam. I'm going to go over here on this side, make sure that my notches line up. So I'm just gently laying this down, lining up my markings. There's my tailor's tack. So what I want to also make sure is that I'm not pulling this over. So I'm just going to put a pin here in the center of the stay to hold it while I'm adjusting over here to make sure, because see, this jacket does have some shaping, so I want to be careful I'm not pulling this tight or pulling it out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead, pin at my little circle marking, and it lines up. Now I didn't quite cut the little jog out because I added 1 inch seam allowance, right? I have 1 inch seam allowance on my side seam, but only 5/8 on my armhole. So that's okay. I can trim that little guy away. Same thing over here. I want to make sure that it fits in there. I'm not pulling it tightly. I do want to smooth it some. I also, because where my markings were, my notches just lined up. It just 3 inches below, the armholes where I marked this. And it just was right above the notch mark. So over here, same thing. Yours may or may not line up with that, and that's fine. So I just want to make sure that it's laying nicely, not pulling. It's okay that I'm not quite exactly. That's just some error in cutting on my part. As long as it fits onto the back of the jacket without pulling. So I don't want to pull. I'm going to do a few more pins here. You should probably use pinking shears on this bottom edge. It doesn't really matter. I don't happen to have any here in my shop right now. But you can pink this edge. It also kind of helps it disappear a little bit. I'm just going to double check from the other side, right? Everything looks like it's laying nice and smooth. I don't see any bubbles. I don't see any ripples. That's what I want. Everything should be where I want it to be. That lines up. All right, so now I'm going to take this over to the machine, and I'm going to sew it just to the seam allowance side of my seam. Now, what I need to remember is that I have 5/8 of an inch seam here at the neck. I have 1.5 inches at my shoulder. It's still 5/8 at the armhole, and it's 1 inch under the arm. And I want to acknowledge that and make sure that I'm sewing close to those seam lines. I feel about stitching this in the way that I do stay stitching, and I do stay stitching almost exactly on my stitch line. Some people like to do stay stitching further into the seam allowance. I like it almost exactly on the seam line. If anything, just a slight touch to the seam allowance side, but that's a personal preference. So once this is all pinned, as mine is, I'm going to stitch under the arm, the armhole, the shoulder, the neck, shoulder, armhole, under the arm. And I'll come back and show you what it looks like once it's stitched. All right, I have stitched my backstay to my fashion fabric back, and you're going to notice this looks a little different than it does in the pattern guide. When we stitch this stay on, it's very similar to a process that we do in construction called flatlining, where we put two fabrics together for whatever purpose, usually for stability like this and support. And I don't turn corners in flatlining, and I don't backstitch in flatlining. So I stop and start, and you'll notice that no backstitch, and I stitched up, and I did turn a slight, corner here to follow on up, but then I stitched off the shoulder. Then I started and did my seam line. I did my neckline, seam line, armhole, slight turn, and went down. And I didn't backstitch anywhere. I used a little bit longer than a permanent straight stitch. I used about a number 3 on my machine, so it lays nice and flat. This is a good thing. We know that we're where we should be when our stitching is going through our markings. Goes through our markings. We've now just stabilized the neck, which is great. Stabilized all this area. Flip it over, and I did go and give it a little press. Right, there's my thread markings on this side. So now I'm ready to sew my shoulder seams and tape my shoulder seams. What that's going to do is, again, stabilize this shoulder a little bit more. Before I do that, though, you may want to, before you tape the shoulder seams, you may want to sew your shoulder seams together, baste them together, and put it on and make sure that the slope of the shoulder works for you. If you had a fitting, you probably already know that, but you may want to just double check. This is now the time to do that. If you need to reshape your shoulder at all, you can. Otherwise, if you didn't fit your jacket, if you feel really confident about the slope of your shoulder, then you can go ahead and sew your shoulder seams for real, as well as putting the tape in there. And I'm going to show you that next.